So you have a wheel set with a DT Swiss EXP rear hub, either 240 or a 180, doesn't really matter. Congratulations, you have the easiest hub to live with, in my humble opinion. Now, if it's the best hub, like all overall, yeah, that's debatable, especially with the rocky start that the EXP had. But when it comes to basic maintenance, it's really hard to beat. You can do this without any special tools, and I will argue that it's easier than to, say, bleed disc brakes or wax a chain or even change the flat tire. And that is what I will try to convince you of in the first part of this video. That's just the basics though. I thought we could level up, try to reach the master level, do a full teardown and rebuild of the rear hub. I will show how to replace every single bearing, and it will also cover how to do a full ratchet upgrade if you want to go to, say, a 54 tooth ratchet. But no time to waste, let's start with the basics. So, like I said, for basic maintenance, there's no special tools or any tools needed at all for disassembly. I don't even have to remove the cassette. Just yank that thing off, end cap will come with it and be trapped by the lock ring, so to speak. Just makes life easier. If I suspect there's a lot of grime around the end cap, removing the cassette will not only give me access to clean that, but it's also an opportunity to give the cassette a deep clean as well. But in this basic scenario, I'll leave it on for now. With the free hub body removed, all we have to do is remove the spring, the loose ratchet ring, the spacer, all of which most likely is left on the hub shell side. There's also a spring washer that's always gets stuck in the free hub body, but it shouldn't be hard to remove. I put all the small parts in a glass jar, and in this case I just use some isopropyl alcohol. Usually I use some kind of parts cleaner, but I try to avoid using aerosol products when I have camera gear around. Just alcohol like this works fine though, or any other degreaser you have laying around. The important part is to get all that grime off. Swish it around a bit and then put it off to the side to let it soak in while I wipe off the worst grime from the free hub. I use Scott paper towels, love those stuff, but an old t-shirt or similar would do the job as well. Once the worst is gone, I put some alcohol directly onto the towel and get in there a bit deeper and clean up as much as I can. Then repeat the same process on the hub side. I always try to avoid spraying any cleaning solutions directly into these parts since I don't want it to creep into the bearings. Speaking of which, it's a good opportunity to give the axle and the bearings on the free hub body a quick spin to make sure everything is spinning smoothly and there's no gritty, grindy feeling to them. By this time, the small part should be plenty happy swimming around in its little alcohol pool. Time to get them out and wipe them dry. The ratchet might need some work when just using alcohol like this. That's why I usually use aerosol parts cleaner. Gets that stuff right off. But a little extra rubbing goes a long way. And that's it for cleaning. Now all that's left is putting it back together. But first we need some new fresh grease, and I really can't recommend anything other than DT Swiss own special ratchet grease. A small container like this, even if it's expensive for the amount, has lasted me like 5 years already and there's plenty left. If you get a ratchet upgrade kit or service kit, you also get a tube of grease included, so no need to buy it separately. Good to know. I have experimented with other greases to varying results, but if somehow shit went south and you had to do a warranty claim, having the wrong grease in there could void your claim, so I would stick with the special grease, but I will leave you to use your own judgment in this area. I use a small brush to apply a layer on the hub side, back on with the spacer or whatever you call this red axle sleeve thingy. Another layer of grease applied to the loose ratchet ring before putting it back on the hub. Unlike the old style ratchet system, the spring here is not directional, it goes on either way. And lastly, a dab of grease on the spring washer that goes on to the top of that spring. Who could have guessed? packing the free hub body side teeth, I guess you call this teeth as well. Anyway, going a bit overboard here with grease does actually quiet things down a tad in my experience. It won't last many rides before it's back to its usual noisy self, but it's better than nothing, unless you're one of those weirdos who like a noisy hub, which in that case, this is definitely the hub for you. Back with the free hub body on the axle, push on that end cap and you're good to go. Super simple. Doing this 2 or 3 times a year will help everything run nice and smoothly. Everyone can do this. Seriously, it's not hard. But let's move on to the advanced part. Whether you have discovered a bearing that needs replacing or you want to do a ratchet upgrade, like going from a 36 to a 54 tooth ratchet for whatever reason, this does require some special tools for the job. I will make heavy use of the DT Swiss own Ratchet EXP Toolkit, which includes these 4 pieces. I will also use a 22mm socket together with a socket wrench to get some leverage on that ratchet ring tool. Alternatively, an impact driver could also be used with a socket, or you could also use a vise instead, as long as it's attached to a workbench. If you only plan on swapping the non-dry side bearing or the free hub body bearings, you don't technically need this toolkit. If you want to change the dry side bearing or the ratchet, which involves removing that bearing anyway, you will at the minimum need the EXP Ratchet ring tool. But having the full kit will make your life so much easier. You can probably find cheaper non-branded versions of this kit if you search hard enough. I will also make use of a hammer with a soft side or a rubber mallet, a chain whip and cassette tool, and some light grease. I have this extra light grease I really like, but pretty much any general grease will work in a pinch, like this Shimano premium grease for example. I still use the DT Swiss special grease for the ratchet. Lastly, I will use a punch, is that what you call it, for working on the free hub body. For this tutorial, I'm going to remove all the bearings, so I will need to remove the cassette. But if you have no plan on touching the free hub body, no need to do that. After the cassette is off, I can just jank that free hub body off like the manly man I am, remove all the small parts and give everything a good clean like we did in the previous section. So if you skip that, feel free to rewind. I won't cover that again here. I also need to remove the disc rotors to be able to remove the non-dry side bearing, which is the first bearing I'll attack. For this removal, no special tools needed, just a few whacks with the soft side of the hammer on the hub axle from the drive side. Shouldn't take too much effort. As you can see, I can do this with just holding the hub in my hand. Once I feel it come loose, I flip the wheel over, remove the bearing from the axle, and I can pull the axle out from the non-drive side. This bearing is a 6802 bearing or equivalent depending on brand. The DT Swiss bearings has a low friction seal on the inside and a more robust seal facing outside, and that's the colored one, light orange or yellow I guess for this ceramic one on the 180 hubs, or red seals for the steel bearings on the 240. They are interchangeable though. Also check the description for all bearing specs and dimensions. So onto the drive side bearing and the ratchet. The bearing actually sits inside the ratchet rings, so I need to remove that to get to the bearing, even if I don't plan to swap the ratchet. Here that ratchet tool will come into play, but just putting the ratchet tool and twist will lead to trouble, as you will need a lot of force and it will definitely slip and potentially damage the tool. Don't ask me how I know. So I need to put the axle back in place. This will keep the tool from slipping or tilting, so to speak, when you put full force on it. Since we have already removed the non-dry side bearing, I used a shorter drift or bush, whatever you want to call it, that's included in the toolkit to keep the axle in place and centered. Now, like I mentioned before, instead of that 22mm socket and socket wrench, you could simply put the tool in a vise like this, thread the wheel on, and use the whole wheel as leverage, turning the wheel counterclockwise to undo the ratchet. I didn't have my vise mounted, so I had to resort to the socket wrench. An impact driver would have been fun though. Yeah. I needed a huge amount of force to get this loose. I couldn't do it on the table, hence it's not on camera. I had to put the wheel down on the floor, but I finally got it loose. It does require a lot more force than you expect. You almost start to doubt if you're doing this the right direction, but once you get it loose, it can easily be unscrewed by hand. To get the bearing out from the ratchet ring, I used the last piece from the toolkit. The ratchet fits like a glove on that 30mm side of this assembly tool, and it has space inside to clear the bearing. Then I used the hub axle again to gently tap out the bearing with the soft side of the hammer. Bit of a clean, and it's time to put everything back together. If you're upgrading a ratchet, you can reuse the old bearing as long as it's still spinning nice and smooth. A bit of grease to help everything slide into place. If using the original bearings or replacements with different seals, you want the colored seal facing into the ratchet ring, since that's the side that will be subject to most of the nastiness. I put the bearing in place by hand, place the ratchet ring back into the 30mm side of the assembly tool, then I gently tap the bearing in, not all the way, just enough so like 2-3mm sticks out. The rest will be pushed in nice and square as I thread the ratchet back into the hub shell. To help with that job, I will put some grease on the threads. Put the hub axle through the hub shell into the shorter drift on the non-drive side, keeping it nice and centered. Thread the ratchet over the axle, and then with the ratchet tool ring, tighten it down as I slowly press that bearing into place. Nice and snug. As you ride, this will set in even tighter. That's why it takes so much force to remove this thing. Flip the wheel over, placing the axle through the longer drift, which puts the axle just in the right position for the non-drive side bearing. Bit of grease on the hub as well as the bearing before using the shorter drift and tapping that bearing back into place. As you can see, having this service toolkit has made this pretty painless, in my opinion. Moving over to the free hub body though, we need to use something else, at least for the first bearing. If we take a look inside the free hub body, there's a loose metal sleeve between the bearings. You can move this around slightly to expose the inner bearing race of the bearing, which is what I will use to tap the first bearing out. So I'm removing the outside bearing first, and I can use the 32mm side of that assembly tool, place the free hub with the ratchet facing down. Then I use the drift to gently tap the bearing out, tapping in an X style pattern. It shouldn't take too much to get the bearing out, and the sleeve will come with it. For the other bearing, I flip both the tool over to the 30mm side as well as the free hub body. Now I have two options. I can either tap the bearing out with the punch like I did the other bearing, or if I have the hub disassembled already, I can again use the hub axle to tap that bearing out like this. I do realize sometimes you don't want to disassemble the whole hub to change the bearing in the free hub body, so in that case the punch method is the answer. Or you could use something like a 30mm socket with an extension and tap it out that way. Quick clean before putting everything back together again. Both bearings are the same 6802 size bearings. Same deal with the low friction black seals on the inside and the colored seal facing out. Here I actually decided to swap out the bearings for some new 6802 NTN bearings, mostly because I was curious, but I also scuffed the original bearing with the punch, so that sealed the deal. I guess a side lesson here: don't remove bearings that are perfectly fine unless you want to show how it's done on video online, I guess. Anyway, this anti-end bearing have the heavy-duty LLU seals on both sides, so no need to take care on which side is which. A bit of light grease on the free hub body side and on the bearing itself. Put it in place as square as possible by hand. Then I used a long drift from the toolkit to tap the bearing in place. Flip the free hub body and mounting tool over and repeat. And here. Did I forget something? Oh, yes, I did. Not only did I manage to put the old bearing back instead of the new, but I also forgot that spacer that's supposed to go in the middle. So learn from my mistakes. Bearing tapped back out, I could put some extra grease on the inside of the bearing and then put the spacer in place, the new bearing, and tapped it in just like I did the other side. And finally, all bearings and sleeves are where they're supposed to be, testing that everything spins nice and smooth. All that's left is giving all the small ratchet part a coat of special grease. Put everything back together the same way we did in the first part of this video, which probably feels like it was a lifetime ago if you managed to watch this whole thing. Kudos if you did. But we're finally done and dusted. Now that I have gone through all that footage, I realized I forgot to show you one thing, and that's the seal ring that's on the drive side of this hub shell. This can be removed and replaced, but you only really do that if it's damaged. But unless you manage to like jab a tool into it or something, there's a very small chance that you will actually need to service this beyond the normal clean you do anyway. But no excuses, I guess we're not quite at that grandmaster level yet. Always good to have goals to look forward to. So I hope you found this helpful, or maybe it just made you decide to bring it to your local bike shop to have them take care of it for you. Either way, thanks for watching, and then drink some water. Let's go ride. Peace!